Okay, so I ran out of credits, so I'm just gonna do the intro. Summary of the story is basically I took an old creepypasta. It was a really bad creepypasta in my opinion, so I changed a few things around, made it more Warhammer themed, and yeah, it's basically about a couple living in a hive city and things transpire between them, I guess you could say. It's supposed to be a creepy story. I don't know if I tried too hard to make it creepy or not, but you gotta let me know what you think. Please like, comment, subscribe, and I have a few things to say at the end of this video about the story, but I don't want to tell you now, or I don't want to talk about it now. Thank you to all of the new subscribers that I'm listing here, and the commenters on the last video, and of course the members. Thank you. So listen to the story, tell me what you think, tell me if I'm trying too hard to be creepy or not. It's supposed to be creepy, and like all my stories, it does have a few problems. Oh well. Please enjoy, and I will talk to you at the end of the video. Enjoy. Thank you.
The hum of the hab block was a dull, ever-present sound, a constant reminder of the Imperium's vast machinery, a world where humanity clung to its routines as much as it did its faith. It was within this unyielding life, amidst the shadows of the Emperor's rule, that I found comfort in the stillness of our small apartment. My wife Lissa had always been a grounding presence, a reliable harbor against the universe's relentless brutality. Lissa was pragmatic, thoughtful, and reserved, a woman who had little tolerance for nonsense. It was this steady nature that first drew me to her, a sense of safety, an island of calm amid the ceaseless storm of our lives under the Imperium's banner. In a world of ceaseless war, loyalty, and fear, Lissa was the only constant that brought warmth, even when the nights were long and the sky beyond was cold and indifferent. Our life was unremarkable, even by the humble standards of our hab block, and in its ordinariness, I took refuge. Every day was a repetition of small rituals. Morning tea, our shared quiet before the day's labor, her slight smile as I left, and the familiar way she'd greet me each night. The universe around us was harsh, unforgiving, and yet within these walls there was a kind of sanctuary, a shared life built from the few fragments of peace allowed to us. Then, on a morning not unlike any other, a subtle fracture appeared in this familiar world. I was preparing for the day, pulling my jacket over my shoulders, when I sensed movement in the hallway outside our sleeping quarters. It was faint, a flicker in my peripheral vision. I turned, expecting to see Lissa moving about her morning tasks, but instead, I saw her partially hidden around the corner, peering at me with only her eyes visible. Her gaze was unwavering, wide and unblinking, the tiniest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth.
Lissa?
I let out a small laugh, more startled than amused. Her expression reminded me of a child playing hide and seek, a rare playfulness I hadn't often seen in her. She didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on mine, the faint smile lingering, a touch too long to be comfortable. Then, with a suddenness that made my heart jolt, she withdrew, slipping soundlessly out of sight. I chuckled to myself, though a faint unease lingered, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. This wasn't her usual behavior. It was as if she was trying to unsettle me, perhaps to break the tedium of our routine. I shook it off, convincing myself that even the most disciplined minds sometimes crave a moment of harmless play. But as I left for my work shift, a strange discomfort took root, a faint itch of worry at the back of my thoughts. I buried it, focusing on the drudgery that awaited me. That night when I returned, she was her usual self, calm and grounded, and the day's strangeness seemed distant and half forgotten. The hab block's dim lighting painted her face in a soft glow, almost reassuringly familiar. and I dismissed the earlier moment as nothing more than a passing quirk. Yet, in the quiet that settled between us, there was a slight shift, a nearly imperceptible tension. It was as though something delicate had been disturbed, leaving ripples in its wake. I found myself stealing glances at her, searching for signs of that playful expression she had shown that morning. But she was merely Lissa, busy with her evening routine, her calm unbroken. The next morning I rose to find her already awake, standing by the narrow window that offered a view of the surrounding buildings, their stark outlines fading into the smog-laden sky. She was motionless, her silhouette dark against the thin light filtering through the grime-covered glass.
Lissa!
I called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, a smile forming, warm, familiar, as if to reassure me, but her eyes, wide and glinting in the dimness, seemed to linger a moment too long, the shadow of her grin settling into something that didn't quite reach her gaze. I felt a chill rise along my spine, a discomfort that I couldn't name. Perhaps she was teasing, I told myself. Perhaps she was simply in a mood I couldn't understand. But there was something about the way her gaze held mine, unblinking, unwavering, that felt wrong. The pattern repeated itself over the next few days, small fleeting moments that I might have otherwise dismissed. I would catch her watching me from behind doors or around corners, her eyes wide and still, her head tilted at an odd angle, as if she was examining something beyond my understanding. It wasn't the playful mischief I had seen before. It was something colder, more intent. Each time she would withdraw, leaving only the faint lingering discomfort in the back of my mind. Our home, once a sanctuary from the vast, indifferent universe, began to feel different, its familiar shadows seeming to deepen, to stretch and shift when I wasn't looking. I'd feel her gaze on me, even when I couldn't see her. The walls seemed closer, the rooms dimmer, and the silence between us more profound. I tried to speak to her, to gently pry into this strange change. But each time I approached the subject, her responses were curt, vague, or lost behind a smile that didn't reach her eyes. There was a coldness in her gaze, an unsettling glint that seemed to sharpen with each passing day. A few times she would catch me watching her, and she would smile, that same faint, unchanging smile, as if nothing was amiss. And yet, the way her eyes tracked me, unblinking and distant, made me feel like a stranger in my own home, an intruder trespassing in her space. One evening as I was washing up, I felt her presence behind me before I saw her reflection in the mirror. She was standing in the doorway, just far enough that the shadows obscured her features, her eyes fixed on me with that same unreadable expression. My heart gave a little jump, a mix of fear and embarrassment that I couldn't explain.
Lissa, what?
I started, but the words felt heavy, awkward in the silence. She tilted her head just a fraction, her mouth quirking upward in that strange, almost childlike smile, and then, without a word, she was gone, leaving the doorway empty, as if she had never been there. That night, I lay awake beside her, feeling her steady, calm breathing, but my mind was restless, haunted by images of her gaze, the way her eyes seemed to hold something just beyond my comprehension. I told myself it was my imagination, that the darkness played tricks on the mind. But as I drifted into uneasy sleep, the thought crept into my mind, unbidden and unwanted. Something was terribly wrong. In the dim confines of our hab-block apartment, the familiarity that had once brought me solace now felt strange and foreign, the shadows thickening as if concealing some hidden truth. And in the silence I sensed a presence, a weight, pressing down, waiting. It was just Lisa, I told myself. Just my wife. But in that moment, as the last trace of sleep slipped away, I could almost feel her eyes on me in the dark, watching, waiting. It was only a few days later when Lisa's odd behavior shifted from disquieting to something that left a lingering chill in the marrow of my bones. Each time I caught her watching me, the intensity in her gaze seemed to deepen, as though she was studying some hidden layer. Varakith, my skin. I began to feel as if I were being dissected by her eyes alone, examined, scrutinized in a way that stripped me bare. One night, as I was in the kitchen preparing a small meal, I felt that familiar prickling sensation again, a faint warning that I was not alone, that someone's eyes were on me. Turning, I saw Lisa in the doorway, partially concealed by the shadows. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, her face devoid of expression but for a slight, unnatural smile that clung to her lips like something glued on, tight and lifeless.
Lisa?
I said, keeping my voice steady, though a hollow unease stirred in my gut. She tilted her head slowly, almost theatrically, but said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until finally she backed away, her face lingering in the shadows for one last unsettling moment, before she vanished down the corridor, the quiet padding of her footsteps fading into the darkness. I stood frozen, my heart pounding harder than I wanted to admit. It was her, wasn't it? Just Lisa, maybe in one of her odd moods, but a voice in the back of my mind whispered otherwise, murmuring in the silence that she was not quite herself, that something darker had settled within her skin. The next morning, over a quiet breakfast, I tried to bring up the night before.
Lisa, last night, when you were standing in the doorway.
I trailed off, struggling to find words that wouldn't sound accusatory or alarmed. She looked up at me, her face blank, almost placid, as if she had no idea what I was talking about.
Last night, I went to bed early. I don't remember standing in the doorway.
Her response was calm, devoid of any defensiveness, and yet something about her tone felt wrong. It was too smooth, too practiced, as if she were reading a line from a script. My confusion deepened, mingling with a gnawing sense of dread that was starting to feel permanent. A weak laugh escaped me, and I tried to play it off, but the unease remained, lodged within me like a splinter. Then, just as I thought I could ease back into routine, she said something that left my blood running cold.
Maybe you were just dreaming, Varric.
She murmured, her voice almost childlike, her eyes fixed on me in a way that felt too steady, too sure.
Maybe I'm always watching, even when you don't see me.
Her words settled into the air like poison, a quiet taunt that echoed in the back of my mind long after she had left the table. I laughed it off, told myself she was joking, that she was only trying to unsettle me. But her expression had been serious, her tone devoid of the warmth I had come to rely on in her. I could feel her words burrowing into me, infecting every thought with the notion that I was not as alone as I'd always believed. Over the following days, it became a ritual. I would feel her eyes on me, watching, waiting, sometimes from around a corner or through a crack in the door. She seemed to appear in places she had no reason to be, her gaze lingering, wide and unblinking. I tried to ask her, tried to speak of the unease clawing at my nerves, but each time I did, she looked at me with blank incomprehension, as if the moments of horror had never happened at all. It began to wear on me. I couldn't move without wondering if her eyes were somewhere in the shadows, lurking, waiting. Our home, once a fortress of comfort, had become a trap, every corner concealing her face. Each room thick with a sense of unnatural presence. The rooms felt smaller, the walls closer, the silence heavier, pressing down like a physical weight. One night, I woke to the sound of something soft, a light, almost inaudible tapping. My eyes adjusted to the dimness, and there, at the foot of the bed, I saw her, kneeling on the floor with her hands clasped, staring up at me with that same unblinking intensity. Her mouth was slightly open, her expression vacant yet unsettling, as if she were waiting for something, or perhaps as though she were drinking in the sight of me in some grotesque way.
Lissa,
I whispered, my voice barely audible, every muscle in my body tense. She remained still, her head tilted at a subtle angle, the dim light casting hollow shadows across her face.
is something wrong?
I forced the words out, trying to sound casual, but they fell flat, trembling in the quiet. She blinked, a slow, languid movement that somehow only heightened my terror.
Wrong? No, Varric.
She said, her voice soft and distant.
I'm just watching, just like you wanted, right?
A shiver coursed through me.
Wanted?
I managed, feeling as if I were speaking through a thick fog.
I don't know what you mean.
She tilted her head, a strange, almost pitying look in her eyes.
You said you wanted me to open up more. Isn't that what I'm doing?
I couldn't find words. I wanted to scream, to tell her to stop, to demand that she be herself again. But something about her expression, her eerily calm demeanor, froze the words in my throat. Her lips parted into a smile, a slow, eerie stretch that seemed to split her face in two. I felt myself shrink away, the edges of the room closing in, the darkness thickening around us. For the first time, it occurred to me that I didn't recognize the woman before me, that something in her eyes, in her smile, had become twisted, changed by some unseen force. By morning she was gone from the room, and I found myself lying in bed, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest as if I had been fighting for my life. Yet when I finally rose, there she was, in the kitchen, brewing tea, her face serene, her movements calm, as if nothing had happened at all.
You seemed restless last night.
She said, glancing over her shoulder with a smile. Her voice was light, almost playful, and yet it lacked warmth, as though it were hollow, missing some vital element that once made her Lissa. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but fear held me back. Instead, I nodded, managing a weak smile, hoping it would suffice. She returned to her task, her expression placid, oblivious, while the unease gnawed at me, relentless and sharp. From that point on, the apartment felt hostile, each shadow filled with the possibility of her face lurking, her eyes waiting. She had begun to haunt me, not as a person but as a presence, an unrelenting watcher in the night. And though I could hear her voice, see her movements, I could no longer shake the feeling that Lissa My Lisa was slipping away, lost to some darkness that lay just beyond my reach. Each night, her appearances grew more unsettling, her eyes colder, her smile sharper, the edges of her gaze hardened by something beyond human comprehension. I was no longer certain if I was living with my wife or a stranger in her skin. One evening, after days of silent dread, I gathered the nerve to confront her.
What's going on? Why are you doing this?
She regarded me with a look that sent a chill down my spine, her smile curling at the edges like something creeping into life.
Doing what?
Her voice was soft, almost amused, but her gaze held none of the warmth I remembered, none of the love that once bound us together. In that moment, I felt utterly alone, as though some dark rift had opened between us, one I could not bridge. It was then I understood, with a sickening certainty, that whatever had become of her was beyond anything I could comprehend. Something insidious, something wrong. And as her eyes bore into mine, a thought slipped, unbidden, into my mind. A quiet, trembling realization that she would not stop. Not ever. It had been weeks since the first unsettling peaks, weeks since I had noticed that something was wrong, but each day seemed to melt into the next, a never-ending blur of mounting dread. The apartment, once a place of sanctuary, had become suffocating, as if the very walls themselves were closing in. The silence between Lisa and me grew heavier, suffocating, her unblinking eyes more frequent, more invasive. At first I could still cling to some semblance of rationality, of the woman I had married, but now it felt like I was living with a ghost, someone who wore Lisa's face, but was not her. Her behavior had become grotesque. One evening, as I returned home from work, the apartment seemed unnaturally still. The hum of the ventilation system that usually filled the quiet space was absent, replaced with an ominous silence. I noticed the flickering lights in the hallway, casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. I stepped inside, my boots echoing louder than usual against the cold tiles. Then I saw her. Lisa was crouched in the far corner of the living room, staring at me. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers twitching involuntarily, and her head tilted at a sharp, unnatural angle. She was grinning like something inhuman. The smile stretched wider than it should have, a grotesque thing that twisted her features. Her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, the whites stark against the deep shadows under her lids. There was no warmth, no recognition in them, just a deep, unsettling emptiness.
Lisa.
I managed, my voice strained and raw.
What's going on?
She didn't move, her body frozen in place. The smile remained, stretched tight like the skin on a corpse.
I'm watching.
She whispered, her voice breathy, almost childlike.
I'm always watching, Varric.
A wave of nausea hit me as I stepped forward. My heart pounded in my chest, an animal panic creeping up my spine. I reached out to her, my hands trembling as I tried to pull her into some semblance of reality. But as I touched her shoulder, I felt her body stiffen, a sharp, unnatural rigidity that sent a chill through my fingertips.
Lisa, please talk to me. What is happening to you?
I whispered, my voice cracking. Her head jerked to the side suddenly, her smile widening further, and she let out a low, eerie giggle. The sound of it, too high-pitched, too gleeful, felt wrong, unnaturally jubilant, in the hollow silence of the apartment.
There's nothing wrong.
she murmured, her words dripping with an unsettling calm.
I'm just playing, Varric. Just playing.
I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts.
Playing? This isn't play, Lissa. You're scaring me.
Her eyes followed me as I backed away, her grin never faltering like a mask that could not be removed. The light in the apartment seemed to dim further, as though her presence was sucking the very energy from the room. The air felt thick, suffocating.
I'm not scared,
she whispered. Her voice tinged with something darker, something not quite human.
I'm having fun.
I could feel my sanity slipping away as I turned and fled from the room. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only run, my heart hammering in my chest, desperate to escape the weight of her gaze, the chill of her presence. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of her face from my mind. Her twisted, mocking grin, the dark emptiness in her eyes. I tried to convince myself that it was just a phase, a lapse in her behavior, that she would return to her usual self in the morning. But deep down, I knew I was fooling myself. This was no temporary madness. This was something deeper, something far darker. The next day, when I returned home, I found her standing in the hallway, her eyes gleaming as she watched me approach. She didn't greet me, didn't smile or speak. She only watched, her gaze locked onto mine, with an intensity that felt almost suffocating.
Lissa.
I began, my voice trembling.
Please, talk to me. You're not yourself. What's happening?
She tilted her head slowly, her eyes narrowing as she examined me.
I'm fine, Varric,
she said, her voice flat, almost mechanical.
You're the one who's confused.
I wanted to scream, to shake her, to demand the woman I had married return to me. But something in her eyes told me that this was no longer my wife. She was lost, corrupted by something I couldn't begin to understand. And I was powerless to stop it. The days blurred together after that. Every time I thought I could reach her, she would pull further away. Her behavior grew more erratic. She would appear in corners of the apartment when I least expected it. Her eyes wide and hungry, a smile ever present, but now tinged with something darker. She would stalk me from room to room, lurking in the shadows, her presence looming behind me, her gaze following every movement. It felt as if she were feeding on my fear, using it to grow stronger, to become something inhuman. I reached out to Korath and Elvira, desperate for someone to believe me, for someone to see what was happening, but their responses were always the same.
She's just going through something, Varric. It's not like you're describing.
They dismissed my concerns as stress, as a momentary lapse in judgment. But I knew what I was seeing, what I was living through. Lissa wasn't just ill. She was something else entirely, something that wasn't her. And it was as if I was the only one who could see it, trapped in this nightmare alone. I even called Lissa's mother, hoping for some explanation, some clue to what was happening to her. But the conversation only deepened the horror. When I mentioned her strange behavior, her mother's voice grew tight, unsteady.
She's been difficult lately,
she said, the words strained, as if she were trying to conceal something.
but there's nothing to worry about. Just give her time. And if you need help, you should speak to a doctor. But don't bring it up with anyone else.
Her words were cryptic, vague and dismissive, as if she knew something I didn't, something too horrible to speak aloud. The conversation ended with her insisting that everything was fine, but I could hear the panic in her voice, the fear that she was hiding. As the days passed, I felt myself slipping further into isolation. Lisa's presence in our home became unbearable. It wasn't just her actions, it was the atmosphere she carried with her, an oppressive, suffocating feeling that seemed to stain every corner, every room. There was no escape from her, no refuge from her watchful eyes, no solace in the familiar. I could no longer trust her. I could no longer trust myself. One night, after another long sleepless stretch, I woke to find her crouched at the foot of the bed, her back arched, her head tilted too far back, her neck twisted unnaturally. Her eyes glowed in the dark, burning with an intensity that made my stomach turn. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, but no sound came from her. I knew then, with a sickening certainty, that there was no going back. She had become something else, something monstrous, and I was now a mere plaything in her twisted game. Days began to blur into nights, and I lost all sense of time. The apartment was no longer my own. It had become a trap, a dark, unyielding maze in which I was prey. Everywhere I turned, her eyes were there, watching, cold and unblinking, filled with a sinister hunger. The walls seemed to pulse with it, the air thickening, pressing in on me as if to smother any trace of sanity I had left. Lisa had become relentless. She would appear in doorways, at the end of hallways, in shadows I swore hadn't existed before, each time her head tilted at that unnatural angle, her mouth frozen in a twisted smile that seemed to mock my fear. And in every instance, her eyes held an intelligence that felt alien, cruel, as though a darkness had taken root within her that saw me as nothing more than something to toy with. Once, I found her crouched Varikeith, the dining table, her fingers splayed against the floor, her face peeking out with a wide, eerie grin. Her lips barely moved as she whispered,
I see you, Varek.
The words slithered into the silence, wrapping around me like cold fingers, chilling me to my core. At night, I would lie in bed, trying to steady my breathing, feeling her presence just beyond the door, knowing she was there, waiting, watching. I could hear the faintest sounds, shuffling, the creak of floorboards, soft, unsteady breaths, as though she were relishing my fear, savoring the control she now held over me. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own home, living under the rule of something that wore my wife's face, but was no longer her. I tried everything to reclaim some sense of reality. I called Korath, begging him to come over, to see for himself. He arrived one night, his face filled with concern and skepticism, assuring me that it was stress, that we'd sort it out together. But as we sat in the living room, my nerves frayed and raw, Lisa watched from the hallway, her face half hidden in shadow, a slight knowing smile curling on her lips.
She's right there.
I whispered to Korath, my voice barely steady, my heart pounding in my chest.
Can't you see it? Can't you see how wrong this is?
Korath glanced over his shoulder, his brow furrowing. He saw her, yet all he saw was Lisa, standing quietly in the shadows, calm and composed. He looked back at me with pity, his hand resting on my shoulder.
Varek, she's just standing there.
He said softly.
Maybe you're both just going through a rough patch. Sometimes stress does things to a person. It'll pass.
But it wasn't going to pass. I could see it in her eyes. the glint of something cruel, watching our exchange with a dark amusement, like she knew she was winning. I barely slept that night. The walls of the apartment seemed to press closer, the shadows lengthening, every creak of the floorboards twisting my nerves tighter, every whisper of movement sharpening my fear. By morning, I could no longer bear it. I had to get out, had to escape before she took whatever shred of sanity I had left. I packed a small bag, grabbed my coat, and left without a word. I didn't care if she watched me go. I couldn't stay another moment in that place. I hiked through the streets to Korath's home, my thoughts a mess of fear and desperation. By the time I arrived, I was shivering, the sense of her presence clinging to me like a stain. Korath greeted me with concern, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of relief, a momentary escape from the nightmare that had consumed my life. I explained what I could, the words stumbling out in a desperate rush, telling him about her eyes, her smiles, the way she seemed to be waiting, always waiting. He tried to reassure me, telling me it was just exhaustion, that I was safe here. But even as he spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I glanced towards the window, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the darkness beyond the glass, I saw her face, pale and distorted by the shadows, her eyes wide, staring, unblinking, her mouth stretched into that same twisted smile, a grotesque parody of the warmth I once knew. Droplets of condensation streaked down the glass from where her breath touched it, as if marking her territory, claiming her dominance. A wave of nausea rolled through me, and I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a lamp. Korath followed my gaze, but by the time he looked, she was gone. All that remained were faint marks on the glass, twin streaks of condensation that bore silent witness to her presence. I felt trapped even in Korath's home. My mind raced, trying to grasp some way out of this horror, some thread that would unravel the nightmare I was caught in. And then, desperate and cornered, I thought of Lissa's mother. She had been distant, cold even, but perhaps there was something she knew, some dark family secret she had hidden from me. I dialed her number with trembling fingers, the ring echoing in my ears as I waited, hoping, dreading. When she answered, her voice was as I remembered, cold, dispassionate, as though she had been waiting for this call.
Marianne, it's Varric.
I began, my voice breaking.
Something's wrong with Lissa. She's not herself. I don't know how else to say it. It's like she's someone else. Or something else.
There was a silence on the other end. A pause that stretched too long, making my heart race. Finally, she spoke, her words slow, calculated.
I wondered how long it would take.
A chill ran down my spine.
What do you mean?
You must understand, Varric.
She continued, her tone steady but lacking warmth.
There are things that run in our family, things better left unspoken.
What things?
I asked, desperation cracking through my voice.
What's happening to her?
But Marianne didn't answer. Instead, she murmured something that sent a fresh wave of horror through me. Something vague, yet loaded with dark implication.
It's better you don't know, Varric. Some things can't be fixed. Some things can't be undone.
The line went dead. I was left holding the phone, staring into the darkness, feeling a dread so profound it nearly consumed me. I returned to Korath and Elvara's living room, my mind reeling. Marianne's words lingered in my ears, looping endlessly, layering dread over dread. It was as if a veil had been lifted, exposing a darkness I could never unsee, a truth that gnawed at the edges of my mind. That night I slept uneasily on Korath's couch, waking every hour, every creak and groan of the house jolting me upright. But it was just before dawn, when the first light crept through the windows, that I felt her presence again. She was there, outside the window, standing perfectly still, her face barely visible in the faint light. She pressed her hands to the glass, leaning forward until her forehead touched it, her eyes locked onto mine, with an intensity that drained the breath from my lungs. I forced myself to sit up, paralyzed by her gaze, my body refusing to move. Her lips parted, forming words I couldn't hear, yet I knew she was speaking to me, calling to me, telling me in some silent, malevolent way that I would never escape her. I scrambled back, choking on terror, the room closing in around me as her eyes seemed to burn into my soul, filling me with an all-consuming dread. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I knew she would follow. She was not merely Lissa. She was something else now, something that wore her face, that haunted my every waking moment, a living nightmare from which I would never wake. And as I stared into her unblinking, beading eyes, I knew with sickening certainty that there was no escape. This was my reality now, an unending descent into paranoia, a twisted horror that would haunt me forever. Her eyes were the last thing I remembered, burning into my mind like hot coals before darkness swept over me, mercifully stealing away the terror. I came to with Korath standing over me, his face a mix of concern and disbelief.
You really think Lissa's out to get you?
He asked softly, almost incredulously.
Varek, she's probably just struggling, man. This sounds like she's going through something too. Maybe if you just talk to her, if you let her see you're there for her, this could be worked out.
I swallowed hard, the memory of Lissa, or what looked like Lissa, etched into my mind. But Korath didn't understand. He couldn't. To him she was just Lissa, troubled maybe, but still the woman he knew.
Look,
Korath said, sighing but steady.
If you're really this worried, I'll go with you. We can sit down with her together. Whatever's going on, you don't have to face it alone.
His words carried a calmness, a supportive warmth, that pierced through my fear just enough to make me nod. With dawn creeping into the room, we set out on foot, crossing deserted streets. The city loomed around us, heavy with silence, every shadow seeming to stretch and crawl. Returning to the apartment was a decision made under the grip of exhausted resolve, a last attempt to confront the nightmare that had become my life. Korath was supportive and understanding, his eyes bright as he decided to come with me. He was convinced that facing the situation directly, finding a way to talk with Lissa, might be the only way to bring me some measure of peace. As we hiked back, the world around us felt distorted, distant, as though separated by some unseen veil. Shadows clung heavily to every corner of the hab block, deepening as we approached the doorway. The air was thick, almost stifling, an oppressive weight pressing down, whispering of the horrors waiting within. Inside, the apartment was dark, the silence thick and almost tactile. Korath murmured something reassuring, but his words felt hollow, drowned out by the suffocating dread that filled the space. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness, and then I saw her. Lissa stood in the hallway, half hidden in shadow, her posture twisted, unnatural. Her head was tilted to an unnatural angle, one shoulder hunched higher than the other. And in her hand, clutched tightly, was a jagged shard of glass, glinting dully in the faint light that filtered through the blinds.
Lissa?
My voice came out weak, a hoarse whisper. Her gaze shifted to me, and for a brief, horrifying moment I saw nothing human in her eyes. They were dark, hollow, almost empty, yet filled with a twisted, feral intent. Her lips pulled into a stretched, unnatural grin that seemed to rip her face in multiple places, exposing teeth that gleamed with an eerie brightness. Korath took a step back, his confidence waning, replaced by an unmistakable fear.
Lysa, you're scaring him. Maybe you should put that down.
But she ignored him, her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, the glass shard glinting ominously in her hand. Her gaze never wavered, her focus on me sharp and unwavering.
I told you, Varric.
She whispered, her voice carrying an unholy glee that twisted my stomach.
I'm always watching. I'm always here.
Korath reached out, his hand finding my shoulder, and gave it a firm squeeze.
Varric, let's go.
He muttered, his voice barely concealing his own mounting terror. But before we could move, Lyssa lunged, her movements fast, unnatural, a blur of motion as she closed the distance between us. The shard of glass slashed through the air, catching the faint light as it sliced towards me. Instinct took over. I stumbled back, narrowly avoiding the jagged edge as it whistled past my face. Her expression twisted with something between rage and ecstasy, a primal, hungry look that sent a bolt of pure terror through me.
Lyssa, stop!
Korath shouted, but she ignored him, her focus entirely on me. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if guided by some twisted, unseen force, her every step filled with a dark, malicious intent. She struck again, the glass catching my arm this time, tearing through the fabric of my coat, a sharp, searing pain blooming where it cut. I cried out, stumbling back, the sight of my own blood a shock, a reminder of the very real, physical danger before me.
Varric, we have to go.
Korath's voice was urgent, desperate. I didn't need to be told twice. As I turned to run, she let out a low, guttural laugh that sent a shiver down my spine. Her footsteps echoed behind me, relentless, each step growing louder, faster, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I could feel her presence, a dark, looming shadow just behind me, her breath hot on my neck, her laughter echoing in my ears. We burst out of the apartment, the door slamming shut behind us, cutting off the echo of her laughter. Korath and I sprinted down the hallway, our footsteps pounding against the floor, the world around us a blur. My heart was hammering in my chest, the cold night air biting into my skin as we stumbled out onto the street, gasping for breath. For a moment, we stood there in stunned silence, the reality of what had just happened settling over us like a dark, suffocating fog. Korath looked at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief.
What was that, Varric?
He whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. I had no words. I was shaking, my mind a mess of terror and disbelief, my arm throbbing from the cut that still seeped blood. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that there was nothing left of the woman I had loved. Lyssa was gone, lost to something dark and terrible, something beyond human understanding. The ride to the Inquisition-sanctioned safe house was silent, the atmosphere heavy, thick with the unspoken horror of what we had just escaped. The streets blurred past each turn, each streetlight a faint glimmer of normalcy that felt foreign, distant. By the time we arrived, the weight of everything had begun to settle over me like a shroud, a heavy, oppressive reminder that there was no going back. The safe house was cold, desolate, its walls thick with silence. The dim light filtering through the cracks in the blinds felt as though it could barely pierce the darkness settling in my mind. I paced the small room, my fingers trembling as I clutched my data slate. Every noise, every whisper of the building settling twisted my nerves tighter, filling the emptiness with the phantom sounds of her footsteps, the echo of her soft, mocking laughter. I forced myself to breathe, to ground myself in the present. I was safe here. I had escaped. She couldn't reach me within these walls. I repeated these words silently, a mantra meant to fend off the dread coiling in my chest. Yet each repetition felt hollow, as if spoken into a void that swallowed them whole. Shadows clung to every corner, lingering just beyond reach, thickening with each passing moment. I tried to call for help. The device clicked uselessly in my hand, the signal blocked. I turned to the door, staring at it as though expecting her face to appear, pressed against the glass, her eyes hollow, waiting. Yet there was nothing, only the unyielding silence and the dark, stretching shadows that seemed to breathe with me, in sync, whispering promises of despair. Just as my heartbeat began to steady, my data slate vibrated in my hand. The screen glowed in the dark, casting a faint, sickly light across the room. My heart pounded as I looked down, dread creeping up my spine, my instincts screaming a warning I couldn't ignore. A new message from an unmarked sender. With a shaking finger, I opened it. The image was blurry, drenched in shadow, but unmistakable. An eye, wide and dark, staring back at me with an intensity that stole the breath from my lungs. Lissa's eye. A deep, hollow black that seemed to pull me in, filling my mind with a vast, consuming dread. I could almost feel her presence through the screen, as if she had bridged the distance between us, reaching across physical boundaries to draw me back into her gaze. Then, another message, short and final. I see you. I dropped the data slate, stumbling back, bile rising in my throat. She was here. No, more than that, she was everywhere. Her presence woven into the very fabric of my reality. I could feel her eyes on me, lurking in every shadow, every darkened corner, watching, waiting. My thoughts spiraled, tangling in the grip of despair. I slumped against the wall, the cold seeping into my skin, my mind unraveling under the weight of what I could no longer deny. Lissa, her soul twisted and reshaped by something far beyond human understanding. She had become a creature, an instrument, wearing the face of the woman I had once loved. The safe house's thin walls and steel locks meant nothing. They were hollow defenses against a power that transcended space and reality. She would always find me, and would never stop. Her influence had seeped beyond her body, extending through the threads of the universe itself, as if her very being had merged with the immaterial darkness that devoured souls and spat them back as nightmares. In that moment, everything I had clung to, every shred of hope or reason, shattered. The weight of the Emperor's protection, the promises of sanctity and salvation, felt like distant, childish fables in the face of what Lissa had become. My universe, once harsh yet solid, had torn open to reveal a dark chasm filled with the whispers of chaos. I didn't notice the slow scrape of a chair across the floor behind me until it was too late. My pulse quickened, every nerve flaring with dread as I turned, heart pounding, sweat gathering cold on my brow. She was there, standing in the doorway, her silhouette half hidden in shadow, her form elongated, distorted, her head cocked to one side, a silent, mocking imitation of the woman I had loved. Her mouth, twisted into an obscene grin, stretched too wide, too unnatural, and her eyes, those endless, unblinking eyes, bore into me hollow, yet filled with an intelligence that seared into my soul.
Varric!
She whispered, her voice soft, echoing with a mocking warmth that twisted into something inhuman.
You thought you could hide.
The words hit me like a physical blow, freezing my blood, paralyzing me in place. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught, strangled in my throat, suffocating under the weight of her gaze.
You wanted me to open up.
She murmured, stepping forward, each footfall a low, dragging scrape against the floor, a rhythm that seemed to resonate with my heartbeat, sinking with the terror that pulsed through my veins.
And I did. I opened myself. To everything.
The room seemed to close in, the shadows virecting, warping around her as if they were part of her, extensions of the malevolent force that had claimed her. She raised her hand, and in it clutched another shard of glass, glinting in the faint light, her fingers pale and skeletal against the dark edge.
Now, Varric.
She whispered, her voice a soft hiss that seemed to fill the room, seeping into every crevice, crawling into my mind.
It's time for you to see.
I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, my back slamming against the cold wall, trapping me as her twisted smile grew, stretching across her face, splitting her mouth into a hideous gaping maw. Her eyes never left mine, and in them I saw the endless depths of the warp, a vast, consuming darkness filled with suffering, with a twisted, eternal hunger. I pressed myself against the wall, my limbs paralyzed, my mind screaming for escape, but there was nowhere left to run. I was cornered, helpless, the last threads of my sanity unraveling as her face loomed closer, her breath brushing against my skin, cold and rancid, filled with the scent of decay and corruption.
Embrace it.
She whispered, her voice echoing with a sinister glee.
Embrace the truth.
In that final moment, as her hollow, corrupted gaze consumed me, I felt my mind shatter under the weight of her presence. She was everywhere, her influence permeating every corner of my thoughts, filling me with an unending dread that stretched far beyond mortal comprehension. There was no sanctuary, no respite, only the dark, suffocating truth that in the universe ruled by chaos, there was no escape. The shadows consumed me, wrapping around my vision, filling my mind with the relentless, unending whisper of her voice, of her laughter, echoing through the darkness, binding me to her in an eternal, inescapable nightmare. And with that, Varric's fate is sealed, lost to a universe where even the deepest love becomes an instrument of terror, leaving him forever trapped in the relentless gaze of a lover transformed into an agent of eternal darkness.
Thank you for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe. Tell me what you thought. Thanks. Okay, so really quick, I'm kind of like saying these things as I'm going over the video again. I want to talk about the ending. So the ending is kind of left up to your interpretation on, you know, what kind of corrupted her. That's kind of how I meant it to go. That's not what was initially planned. Initially, and it still kind of flows like that, but initially it was, it's supposed to be Slaanesh is the one that's corrupting, but Slaanesh is feeding off of the husband's longing for safety and comfort and the fear of losing that or not having that. And so Slaanesh then corrupts his wife so that Slaanesh can feed off of his pain, fear, desire, right? His longing. And that was the initial idea, at least. It didn't really pan out that way, exactly that way, but that was the initial thought. And then I actually removed, I guess the reason why it's so jarring, going from when they leave the house, with his wife going crazy and him going to the safe house. There's probably 2 chapters there that were missing. One that explains, you know, him packing up from from his friend's house and stuff, and then explaining kind of what the safe house is, because I'll be honest with you, the Inquisitor safe house it doesn't exist in the lore. I made it up. And so I had this whole thing where I kind of like explained it, and it was like this whole, it doesn't matter now, I guess, but you can just think of it as like False Haven, right, where the Inquisition lures these people here to, like, in a sense of safety and comfort, like they'll be taken care of and everything, but then they're just interrogated, you know, they're put through all kinds of tortures, they're, you know, because they're essentially admitting to heresy in one form or another. So that was kind of the idea behind it. And then the other chapter that I removed had the explanation of him explaining it to his friend, saying that he kind of like has to go and stuff, and like he can't, you know, stop seeing her and stuff. Friend kind of agrees that he should at least just go and report it first and see where that takes him. He says no, I need to get like out of it, kind of thing. And then it talks about his journey to the safe house briefly. It explains the safe house in a little bit more detail, and he has some recollection on what's going on with you know, with everything that's happening and stuff. So with those 2 chapters missing, it is pretty jarring, because it's like he just runs away and then all of a sudden he's on his way to the safe house that doesn't exist in Warhammer lore and it's not explained. So there's that. Lastly, I just want to say that going forward, I'm going to be putting all this stuff kind of that I just said, all the commentary, quote unquote commentary, or talk about it, instead of putting it after video in this long drawn out thing, I'm just going to put it in a comment. I'm just going to use voice to text to do it, so it's no big deal. And so that way, if you do want to know more about it, or mistakes that I know I made, or things that are missing, or this or that or whatever, me just talking about the story, instead of it being like this, it'll just be in the comments. That way those people that want to see it can go see it and read it, and people that just want to get to the next video, you know, they don't have to listen to me talking for 4 minutes until the next video plays. So this is going to be the last video where I do this format. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, I'm going to make a comment, so there'll be more about it. This story was fun to make. I think I made it too, I don't know, I was trying too hard to make it creepy, and it kind of came off as not creepy to me. But I don't know, tell me what you think. Oh shit, but I don't know. So tell me what you think. Like, comment, subscribe. We're almost at 1,000. I'm super stoked. I only have 1 tone of voice, so, but I am super stoked. So I thank everyone that subscribed, everyone that's watched, liked, commented. It's super cool. More stories coming on the way. We'll let you go. Let me know what you thought. Please let me know what you thought. I need more feedback. I always say that. Give me feedback. You, right there. You listening right now. You. Yeah, you. Okay, let me know what you thought, you know, like give me feedback. I need to know. Good, bad, it's all fine. Don't be mean. You, don't be mean, okay? You, yeah, I'm talking to you. Don't be mean, but feedback's nice. All right, have a good morning, have a good lunch, have a good night, have a good dinner, have a good sleep. Good night, good night, good night. I'm going to bed, so good night. Talk to you soon. Thank you for listening. Bye.